We're looking at the beginning, and not necessarily creation stories, but the beginning of faith in the Judeo-Christian story. And what's interesting about that is that, well, we tell all kinds of origin stories. We tell how we came to faith. We tell how we got into a certain role or certain place, how we got here. I have conversations with people all the time, and the second that they learn I'm American, the next question, well, why are you here? And I spend the first 30 seconds of our conversation trying not to get to, I'm a pastor, at the end of that. But that's always well, how'd you get here? Why are you here? Oh, well, I came up for work. Oh, okay. What do you do? So we tell origin stories all the time, and they're important because we have so much that we learn from somebody about their history, from people, about the history of a race, or the history of a culture, or the history of a country. I've learned a lot about Canada since I've got here. And some of those things I attribute our differences, I attribute to how we came into being in those origin stories as a nation. I'm not going to go into that because I'll offend most of you. But we care about our origin stories, right? We learn something about who we are, and we learn something about who somebody else is. And it changes how we look at the world and how we look at people. When I was studying in school, one of the things that intrigued me was the origin stories of faith, the origin stories of Christianity. So we get to Jesus as we're working back through Christian history, and we get to Jesus and we go, well, Jesus was a Jew. So then we start working back further, and we get down to Abraham and the covenant with God, and Abraham just simply experiencing God. And if we keep asking that question, well, what's before that? We get to a place where we can't really tell you about what religion looked like. We can't really tell you about what Christianity or Judaism looked like, or the Hebrew faith, or their connection to Yahweh. What we can tell you is, here's how some people experienced God, and it changes as we get into that story. There's some interesting tidbits in that as you start digging deeper in. For example, several other cultures or religions or peoples tell stories about a flood in their history. We don't know when our story about Noah really came to be. We can't faithfully, I should say, identify a time period that happened. And that this story got told, and when it got written down, and all of that. So we know there are multiple flood stories going around. We know that there are pieces in how people lived out their faith in the Hebrew text that correlate with other religions of that time. Sometimes in contrast, and sometimes it looks like there's shared things going on in how they identify their faith and how they practice worship. Well, that's interesting, right? And that's why I kept going in that story. And let me tell you, it's interesting to a point, and then it gets tiresome. It gets tiresome to keep going. But all that to say is that these stories about Abraham's family, and about a different family that experiences God and just has a need to move forward, and a need to worship, and a need to bless those around them because they are a different family, this changes how we look at our own faith and how we live that out. So this morning we've come through Abraham, we've come through Jacob and Esau. We've now come to a place, okay, where Jacob is back with his brother. He's in this land, and he and he's been reunited. We expected Esau to be a terrible person. Turns out he wasn't, and he gives him a big hug, and they cried together. And then Jacob starts having children, and now we get a new story about the children of Jacob. And this gets kind of weird, kind of fast, okay? So we're going to jump right into Jacob's children. He's got a bunch of children. Remember, he's got multiple wives. But his favorite was Rachel, and he spent 14 years in an effort to get Rachel to be his bride. And so he has a special place for her, and he has a special place for her children when it comes to that. So when Joseph is born, Joseph gets special treatment. There are, I don't remember, like a dozen other kids that we're working with, from wives and maidens of wives and that sort of thing. So we're working with lots of kids, but Joseph is treated differently. And because of that, his brothers don't like him. Now, this may not surprise you, but I grew up without brothers and sisters. It was just me. You may not be surprised with that. But I don't understand the sibling rivalry thing. Like, why can't we all just get along kind of stuff? And why do we need to be fighting over things? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. I always wanted someone else to play with, right? And so this story is a little bit lost on me, but I think some of you with siblings understand a sibling rivalry, and that's really what's going on. And worse than that is that Joseph really is getting special treatment. And Benjamin, his brother, his younger brother from Rachel, is also getting special treatment. And so the brothers kind of resent him. So even though he's young, even though he's not expected to be doing anything great, he begins having these dreams. And this is great. Let's hear one. Let's see. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. They said to him, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed." He said to them, "They were binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brothers said, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. And that's not his only dream. And apparently he didn't have a lot of sense, because he continued to share these dreams with his brothers. Now, that dream would make me angry. I'm starting to understand the rivalry a little bit when you tell somebody that, when you tell somebody that dream. I get that. But what's interesting, and what I want us to focus on, is the story that happens next. So we see a little bit of the hatred, we see a little bit of the frustration going on, but what happens next is that his brothers hate him so much that they plot to kill him. And one brother has some sympathy, and he says, well, maybe we don't kill him, maybe we just put him in a pit and just leave him there. Now, he kind of thought, well, we'll come back later. And they actually planned to come back later and sell him. But when they came back, he was gone. So they took his robe and they covered it in that special robe that he had made just for him. They covered it in blood from a ram or something, and took it back to their father and said, I don't know, can you tell us if this is this Joseph's robe? I like that, get the father to identify, that's clever. Can you identify this robe, basically, is how they did that. Well, they had planned to sell him and make some money off of him, but they came back and he was gone. And he had already actually been sold to some travelers that were headed to Egypt, which is where he ends up. So here is child, okay? He's hated by his brothers. He seems unaware of that. But he's hated by his brothers. It probably gave him a pretty hard time. He's moved into a new land without them after being thrown in a pit. Now, surely now he knows his brothers hate him. And he's moved into a foreign land. And everything that should be expected from this person is to let go, right? I mean, you would expect sort of that will or that heart to be broken so that he moves on, lives out his life as a slave or whatever he's doing. But the reality is that Joseph saw himself differently. He saw himself as part of God's story, and he saw himself living out a life that was different. Now, I read an article this week. I don't do this often. I read an article about Gen Y. And it clearly not written by Gen Y person. Going on and on about Gen Yers being yuppies that desire to be treated differently, think they're special, been told by their parents that they're unique and they get to live this grand life as the center stage. And I look at Joseph and I think, I'm pretty sure this isn't a Gen Y feature. Because here's a boy amongst a dozen brothers that is telling stories about his dreams of being just that, special, center stage. But all of it is deeply connected to God. And that's where I think our focus needs to shift when we're talking about the unique stage, the role that we play. All of it is focused on God, saying, I am part of God's story. That God has called me to be something different, to live out in a different space. And it doesn't matter what happens to Joseph, he sees his life deeply connected to the story of God. And so even in the midst of this incredible pain and suffering, he's been sold. Give me 1 second. He's been sold, and now he enters into Egypt as a slave. And even in this moment, he is attempting to live out his partnership with God, if we can talk about him having a partnership. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him an overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. So Joseph is here in this dark place, and even in the midst of that, apparently his dreams have not left him. Apparently he is strong-willed enough to see that God is going to work with him and that he is going to work with God no matter what. And so he works hard and he loves, and he shares that. And he apparently shares it with Potiphar because even Potiphar knows who he is and who he's focused on and who is blessing him. Here's our call. This is what this story really brings to us, is that Joseph tells this dream about being the center stage. He tells this dream about his brothers bowing down to him. But he sees this as a place for him to serve from. This place of him being working with God to serve those around him. So even in the depths, he serves Potiphar with everything he has. Even in the midst of all of this suffering, he is willing to be just working out, living his life with God. And it just doesn't matter what situation you put him in. God blesses him, and he works hard to offer that love and that service to whoever it is. We don't necessarily relate to being put in slavery. We don't necessarily relate, I don't even relate to him and his sibling rivalry. But here's what we can relate to, is that our role to be partnered with God, our role to step into sort of that center stage to say, yes, I am called to be partnered with God, is extremely important for us to share who God is. It's extremely important for us to take ownership of being blessed and sharing that with those around us. We're blessed in ways that we don't understand. And we have an opportunity to share that with people in ways that they don't understand. That's what Joseph did. Potiphar didn't understand what was going on, but all he knew is that this man was connected to God and that everything he touched was made better. I don't know if that's financially better. I don't know if it's spiritually better. I don't know what that really looked like. But Potiphar saw something different in him. And it's because Joseph lived in a way that believed that he was special, that he was called, that he was part of God's story. So everywhere we go, this is weird, take it and run with it. Or call me tomorrow and say, Bradley, you can't talk about us like that. But here's the deal. You have to live, like everywhere that you go, you are called by God to be in that place. True or not, people's lives will change when you do that. Because you live out your faith. You live out who you are working for. You live out your service to God. You live out you live out God's love. And people recognize that. And you recognize that. Your life changes. Their lives changes. That's what Joseph did. And if I can say it, that's what Gen Y is called to do. Yuppies or whatever you want to call them, us, depending on what kind of math you're using. The point is there. The point is that every one of us is special and called by God, and living that way changes people's lives. Okay, you have to turn it outward. You can't just say, I'm special. You have to turn that outward. I'm special to take part in God's work, to do that in the lives of those around me. There's a flip thing going on, right? You got to turn it back outside. It's not just you. It's not just me. And it wasn't just this family. Joseph didn't say, I'm just special. Abraham didn't say, I'm just special. He said, I'm special to bless those around me. And that's your call. That's my call. That's the Christian's call.